Welcome to Ask a Scholar, a collaboration between Virginia Civics and the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. I'm Jen Patia-Howell, Co-Executive Director of Virginia Civics, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes constitutional literacy, critical thinking, and civic engagement, empowering the next and now generation of leaders in Virginia. With Ask the Scholar, students and teachers are in control. So you ask the questions, and Miller Center experts are here to give you their take on the answers. And with me today to answer your question is Professor Barbara Perry, the Gerald L. Baliles Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the Miller Center. Professor Perry, welcome to Ask a Scholar. Would you introduce yourself to our viewers and tell us a little bit about the Miller Center?
Sure. Thank you, Jen. Thanks so much to have me come today and talk to you and the students and teachers about their questions about constitutional law and our U.S. Constitution generally, one of my favorite topics. I've been at the Miller Center, as you mentioned. I've been there for about a decade now. I co-chair the oral history program, which studies presidencies from the Ford administration now all the way through the Obama administration. We've interviewed presidents and their top advisors for all of those administrations. And I also lead our presidential studies section, which in addition to the oral history program has a recordings program that analyzes and edits the tapes that presidents made in real time of their conversations, particularly starting in the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon eras. And those are all available to students and teachers on our website, in addition to a section called The American President. So if students are searching for the histories of American presidents, there are essays by top scholars and journalists on every single one of our presidents, links to primary sources and links to these oral histories and to the presidential recordings. So for students and teachers to go to www.millercenter.org, look at American President, click on that, and they will be taken to just an entire treasure trove of information. This for me is the perfect job. I know people sometimes wonder if that exists, but I will tell you that it does, and it is at the Miller Center. For someone like myself, who's starting when I was only 4 years old and my mother took me to see John F. Kennedy, I've been interested in presidents really since that very moment when I saw my first president in person, up close and personal. So I've been studying the presidency and the Constitution and the Supreme Court and civil rights and liberties, constitutional law, particularly since high school, college years. Made that the focus of my study at the University of Oxford and then at the University of Virginia, where I did my PhD. And the high point for me was in the mid-1990s, getting to serve for an entire year at the US Supreme Court as a judicial fellow, helping to write speeches for the then Chief Justice William Rehnquist, visiting dignitaries on tours of the court, briefing them about our system. And it's just important to know that our system around the world is much admired, and that after the Cold War ended and we had new democracies in the world, people would come to learn about Washington and about our constitutional system and about our courts, and they would say, we really admire your system. How can we get there? Our system isn't perfect. We know it's not. But it's good to know that it is admired by those around the world, and we hope we can get back to that soon as well. But I also want to mention to students in college, you can look into internships. They have them at the US Supreme Court. We hope the court will open again soon in post-pandemic times, but do look into that if you are interested in perhaps pursuing a career in law, or like myself in teaching and teaching government and political science.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Perry. And I think those who are submitting questions to Ask a Scholar are certainly interested in these topics, and they are submitting some wonderful questions. This question today is from Ethan, who is a senior at Glen Allen High School. This one is a doozy. He asks, how have natural rights thinkers evolved over time, and how does the Constitution reflect that change over time?
Ethan, this is a doozy of a question, in that it is highly sophisticated and very impressive that you are asking it. And it caused me to have to do a little bit of digging and remind myself, going back to my graduate school years, about natural law. It's something that I think we take for granted, in part because Thomas Jefferson said about it in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is really the crux of natural rights and natural law as it begins in our American system. But I'm sure, Ethan, you're familiar with the fact that the concept of natural law, natural rights, actually goes back to ancient philosophers, comes up through the Middle Ages, through theologians such as Thomas Aquinas, for example, and then through the British philosophers, particularly the political philosophers in the 17th century, Hobbes and Locke, for example, and particularly John Locke, who indicated that when people live, he called it in a state of nature, that is prior to societies being formed and prior to governments being formed, that they have these natural rights. He said, you have complete equality in the state of nature, but he said, here's the only problem. There are no laws to prevent people from, perhaps if they're a bit stronger than you physically, beating you up or even taking your life. And so people realize it's better to form into societies and governments and have laws. And so based on those natural laws, natural rights that some believe are God-given, some believe just come from the universe or from nature, but I think our founders really did believe that they came from God, that comes out of the concept of Locke, who said our natural rights are life, liberty, and property. That was somewhat changed, as we noted, by Jefferson in the Declaration. Well, how does that get into then the Constitution? So it comes in particularly through the Fifth Amendment and the fact that it has a concept of due process, that our life, liberty, and property cannot be taken by the government from us without due process, which most people think is a fair process. And we want to make sure that the government is fair when it is treating us, especially if it's going to take our life, liberty, or our property. It also gets incorporated into the 14th Amendment, which in terms of our legal language means it's incorporated now and applies to the states, that the states, in addition to the federal government, cannot take our life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So there you have in our system, in our Constitution, these natural rights. So now how does that develop, which I think is the crux of what Ethan is asking? How does that develop over time when the 14th Amendment, the Fifth Amendment are interpreted, particularly by the US Supreme Court? And I would put it this way, that conservative members of the Supreme Court, going back to the post-Civil War era, thought that natural rights included the rights of corporations to be free from government regulation, the right of corporations to contract with their employees. And so it was very hard for employees to try to get any rights vis-a-vis corporations, because corporations were thought to have this natural right of business and contract. As the court developed and evolved and became more liberal in the 1930s, particularly under FDR and those he was placing on the court who were more liberal, or justices who were changing their positions from a pro-corporate rights position to, in the midst of the Depression, realizing we had to have some regulation of corporations. They couldn't be completely free and run roughshod over individuals or over workers in the midst of the Great Depression. And so the court begins to change. And this gives the crux of Ethan's question, that the concept of natural rights really switches from focusing on businesses and corporation and their rights to individuals and group rights. So that begins in the 1930s with the New Deal court, comes through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s with the court developing what it calls substantive due process, sort of takes us out of the fairness in terms of how a law is applied to what does that law mean? What is the substance of that law? And so substantive due process then, as a natural rights corollary, comes to mean protecting individuals and particularly minority groups. Because if you're in a minority, the majority in our system of majority rule can really lord it over you and take away your rights. So the court, particularly in the 50s with cases like Brown versus Board of Education, really cares about the racial groups and their rights to equality, women's rights then in the 1970s, as well as gender rights in particular. Men and women should be treated equally under the law. That's viewed as a natural right, particularly someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg had that view in the 1970s. In the 1960s, another natural right or substantive due process concept that was developed was the right to privacy. That protected people, particularly even married couples who wanted to use birth control. That was being governed by states, and the court said, no, that's a violation of the right to privacy. But there's no real right to privacy explicitly in the Constitution, so that's based on natural rights. That then becomes the basis of the abortion decision in Roe v. Wade. And then bringing it right up to the present, I think the court's view of LGBTQ rights, the right to marriage equality, the right to have the 1964 Civil Rights Act apply to LGBTQ individuals in the workplace under the 64 Civil Rights Act. I think that's another example of how the development and the evolution of natural rights has had an impact on the Constitution, constitutional law, civil rights and liberties, and how the Supreme Court and its justices have interpreted those.
Wonderful, thank you. There's so much there to dive into, and I know, Ethan, this is going to be just the beginning or maybe the midpoint of your exploration into these questions that are still ongoing. So thank you so much, Professor Perry, for your insights, and Ethan, thank you for your question. If you have a burning constitutional question, let us know. You can submit your questions at vacivics.org/askascholar. On behalf of Virginia Civics and the Miller Center, thanks for watching. Keep the questions coming and let's keep the conversation going.